The rancher saved the native girl from being branded with a hot iron, and the next day she asked to be his woman. The iron glowed cherry red in the dying campfire, and Sarah knew this would be the last thing she ever felt. 3 days of captivity had taught her that mercy was a luxury these men could not afford. The rope burns on her wrists had stopped bleeding, but the fear in her chest grew heavier with each passing hour. 20 years of life, and it would end here in this godforsaken stretch of Wyoming territory, marked like cattle before they put a bullet in her head. The leader, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and dead eyes, lifted the brand from the coals. Steam rose from the metal as he approached, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother's stories, of warriors who faced death with songs on their lips. That was when the gunshot rang out. The brand clattered to the ground as the man spun, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against his dirty shirt. Through the chaos that followed, Sarah saw him, a tall figure silhouetted against the horizon, rifle in hand, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "I suggest you boys find somewhere else to be," came a voice, calm as Sunday morning but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Jack Morrison had been riding fence for 3 days when he spotted the smoke. In this territory, smoke usually meant trouble, and trouble usually meant death for someone who did not deserve it. He had learned long ago that the difference between civilization and savagery was often measured in the seconds it took to decide whether to ride toward danger or away from it. The men scrambled for their weapons, but Jack had already shifted position. The second shot took the gun from the hands of a bearded man who had been reaching for his holster. The third shot sent dust flying inches from the boots of another who had been edging toward the horses. "Next one goes center mass," Jack called out, working the lever action of his Winchester with practiced ease. "Your choice, gentlemen." These were not gentlemen, of course. Jack could smell the desperation on them from 50 yards away, the sour stench of men who had crossed too many lines to ever find their way back to decency. They were the kind who preyed on the helpless because they lacked the courage to face anything that could fight back. The wounded man pressed his hand against his shoulder, his face pale beneath 3 days of grime. "You have no idea what you are meddling in, stranger. This here is tribal business." "Funny thing about tribal business," Jack replied, never taking his eyes off the group, "usually involves more than 3 white men and a branding iron." The truth hung in the air like gun smoke. These men were deserters, or worse, the kind who had learned that the frontier offered opportunities for cruelty that civilized places did not permit. They had found this girl alone, probably while she was gathering medicines or checking trap lines, and decided that her life meant less than their entertainment. Jack had seen enough of such men during his years in the cavalry. He had learned to recognize the look in their eyes, the way they moved when they thought no one was watching. Some men were broken by the frontier's harsh realities. Others were simply given permission to become what they had always been underneath. "Cut her loose," Jack commanded, his rifle trained on the leader's chest. "Like hell we will," the bearded man snarled. "We caught her stealing from our supplies." "With what?" "She is tied hand and foot, and I do not see any stolen goods." Jack's voice carried the patience of someone who had heard every lie the frontier had to offer. "Cut her loose, or I start reducing the population of this camp by 1 every 10 seconds. The men exchanged glances. They were used to intimidating the helpless, not facing someone who clearly knew how to handle both a rifle and the moral complexities of frontier justice. The wounded leader nodded toward one of his companions, who reluctantly drew his knife and sawed through the ropes binding Sarah's wrists and ankles. Sarah rubbed her wrists where the rope had bitten into her skin, but she did not run. Something about the stranger's presence suggested that running was not necessary, not yet. She watched him with dark eyes that missed nothing, cataloging his movements, his weapon, the way he positioned himself to keep all 3 men in his line of sight. Jack Morrison was not a young man anymore. At 38, He had accumulated enough scars and hard-won wisdom to recognize that this moment balanced on the edge of a knife. These men would not forget this humiliation. They would carry it with them like a wound, and wounds had a way of festering in the frontier heat until they poisoned everything around them. But the alternative was to ride away and leave the girl to whatever fate these men had planned for. Jack had done many things in his life that he regretted, but he refused to add that particular sin to his collection. "Now mount up and ride out," he ordered. "I see you in this territory again." We finished this conversation with less talking. The men gathered their gear with the sullen efficiency of those who knew they had been beaten but not destroyed. The wounded leader pressed a dirty cloth against his shoulder, his eyes promising future violence. "This is not over, stranger," he said as he hauled himself into his saddle. "We know your face now." "Good," Jack replied. "Makes it easier for both of us." They rode out in a cloud of dust and muttered curses, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard ground until the sound faded into the vast silence of the Wyoming wilderness. Only then did Jack lower his rifle and turn his attention to the girl. Sarah stood near the abandoned campfire, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. She was young 20 at most, with the kind of beauty that belonged to wild places. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her doeskin dress bore the intricate beadwork that spoke of careful craftsmanship and cultural pride. Despite her ordeal, she held herself with a dignity that impressed him. "You hurt?" Jack asked, keeping his distance. He had learned that rescue could feel like another kind of captivity if handled incorrectly. Sarah shook her head, still studying him with those dark eyes. She seemed to be measuring something about him, weighing factors that only she understood. "They said you were stealing from them," Jack continued. "Any truth to that?" A slight smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first expression he had seen from her that was not pure survival instinct. "I was hunting rabbits near the creek when they found me. They had no supplies worth stealing." Her English was accented but clear, each word chosen with care. Jack nodded, understanding that her education had come from missionaries or traders, people who had recognized her intelligence and given her the tools to navigate both worlds. "Got somewhere to go?" he asked. Sarah gestured toward the mountains that rose like stone monuments against the evening sky. "My people have a winter camp 2 days north, but ... double quote." She paused, and something flickered across her face, uncertainty or perhaps calculation. "I do not think it is safe to travel alone now." Jack followed her gaze toward the mountains, then looked back at the dust clouds still visible on the southern horizon. Those men would not simply disappear. Men like that carried grudges the way others carried water as a necessary supply for survival in hostile territory. "I have a ranch about 6 hours southwest of here," he said. "You are welcome to rest there while you decide what comes next." The offer surprised him even as he made it. Jack had lived alone for the better part of 15 years, preferring the company of horses and cattle to the complications that came with human relationships. His ranch was his sanctuary, a place where the past could not reach him and the future remained as vast and undefined as the horizon. But something about this girl's situation reminded him of choices he had made long ago, decisions that had shaped him into the man he was today. Perhaps it was the way she had faced her captors without begging, or the dignity she maintained even in the worst circumstances. Or perhaps it was simply that the frontier had rules, and one of those rules was that you help people when you could, because someday you might need help yourself. Sarah considered his offer with the same careful attention she had given everything else. Her eyes moved from his face to his rifle, to his horse grazing nearby, to the distant mountains where her people waited. Jack could almost see her mind working through the possibilities, weighing risks against benefits, survival against trust. "You do not know me," she said finally. "I could be a danger to you." "Could be," Jack agreed, "but those men definitely are. Sometimes the smart choice is to pick the risk you can live with." The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the violence that had just occurred. Soon it would be dark, and darkness on the frontier belonged to predators, both animal and human. They needed to be somewhere safe before the light failed completely. Sarah made her decision with the same quiet resolution she had shown throughout her ordeal. She walked toward Jack's horse, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up in wild places. As she approached, Jack caught the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to her clothing, the smell of a life lived close to the land. "I accept your offer," she said, "but I will not be a burden. I can work for my keep." Jack helped her mount behind him, noticing how easily she settled into the rhythm of the horse's movement. Her hands gripped his belt with practical efficiency rather than fear, the grip of someone who understood horses and trusted her own balance. As they rode toward his ranch, Jack found himself wondering what he had just committed himself to. Hospitality was one thing, but this felt different. This felt like the moment when a man's life divided into before and after, though he could not yet say which direction the change would take him. Behind them, the abandoned campfire sent smoke spiraling into the darkening sky, a signal visible for miles to anyone who knew how to read such things. Jack urged his horse to a faster pace, knowing that safety was still hours away and that some conversations were better finished under the protection of walls and locked doors. The ranch house appeared as a cluster of warm lights against the darkness, surrounded by the familiar sounds of cattle settling for the night and horses moving restlessly in the corral. Jack had built this place with his own hands, shaping it into exactly what he needed, a fortress of solitude where a man could think his own thoughts and make his own choices without interference from a world that often demanded more than it offered. Now he was bringing that world home with him in the form of a 20-year-old Lakota woman whose presence would change everything he had carefully constructed over the past 15 years. Sarah slid down from the horse with the same fluid grace she had shown throughout their journey, her feet touching the ground without sound. She stood looking at the ranch house, taking in the solid construction, the well-maintained corral, the neat arrangement of outbuildings that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. "You built this yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Most of it," Jack replied, unsaddling his horse. "Been working on it for about 15 years now." "It is a good place," Sarah said, and something in her tone suggested she understood the effort and sacrifice that such a place represented. Jack led the horse to the corral and began the familiar routine of evening care-checking hooves, ensuring fresh water, measuring grain. The mundane tasks helped steady his thoughts, providing a buffer between the violence of the afternoon and the uncertainty of whatever came next. Sarah watched him work without offering to help, but not out of laziness. She was studying him, learning his habits and routines, understanding the rhythm of his life. Jack had the sense that she missed very little, that behind those dark eyes was a mind that cataloged information and drew conclusions with remarkable speed. When the horse was settled for the night, Jack turned toward the house. Sarah followed without hesitation, though he noticed she paused at the threshold not from fear, but from some cultural consideration he did not fully understand. The interior of the house reflected its owner's practical nature. The furniture was solid and well-made but not fancy. Books lined shelves built into one wall, and a stone fireplace dominated the main room. Everything was clean and organized, the home of a man who lived alone but had not surrendered to the slovenliness that often accompanied solitude. "There is a spare room upstairs," Jack said, lighting a lantern. "Clean bedding, wash basin. Door has a lock if it makes you feel safer." Sarah nodded her thanks, but she did not immediately head upstairs. Instead, she moved to the window that faced south, the direction from which danger would most likely come. Her fingers traced the edge of the glass, and Jack realized she was checking the view, the escape routes, the defensive possibilities. "They will come," she said quietly. "Maybe," Jack replied, "but not tonight. Too dark for tracking, and they do not know this country like I do." Sarah turned from the window, and in the lamplight Jack could see the exhaustion she had been hiding. 3 days of captivity followed by hours of travel had taken their toll, but she had endured it all without complaint. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to explore. Jack had been asking himself the same thing during the long ride home, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with pieces that did not quite fit together. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Many men know what is right," Sarah replied. "Few act on it when acting carries a price." Jack met her eyes, recognizing the wisdom that came from living in a world where survival often depended on understanding the difference between words and actions, between what people said they believed and what they actually did when tested. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we figure out the next move." Sarah nodded and headed toward the stairs, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. At the bottom of the staircase, she paused and looked back at him. "My name is Sarah," she said. "Sarah Crowfeather, Jack Morrison," he replied. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face, revealing the young woman beneath the survivor's mask she had worn throughout their brief acquaintance. "Thank you, Jack Morrison," she said, and then she was gone, leaving him alone in the lamplight with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his carefully ordered life was about to become very complicated indeed. Jack sat in his chair by the fireplace long after the house had grown quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of night in the Wyoming wilderness. Somewhere out there, 3 men nursed their wounds and their pride, planning their next move. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new consequences for choices made in the heat of the moment. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Jack Morrison was not alone in his house, and the knowledge sat strangely with him, not uncomfortable exactly, but different. Change had entered his life disguised as a rescue, and now he would have to learn to navigate waters he had been avoiding for most of his adult life. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming weather, and Jack knew that storms were gathering on more horizons than one. The morning brought with it the kind of crystalline clarity that only existed in the high country, where the air was thin enough to see for miles and every detail stood out with knife-sharp precision. Jack woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found coffee already brewing on the stove downstairs. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, fully dressed, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She had braided her long black hair and somehow managed to clean the trail dust from her doeskin dress. In the morning light, she looked younger than her 20 years, but there was something in her posture that spoke of decisions made during the night. "Sleep well?" Jack asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot she had prepared. "Well enough," she replied, not turning from the window. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday." Jack waited, sensing that this conversation had been rehearsed in her mind during the dark hours before dawn. Sarah was not the type to speak without purpose, and whatever she had decided would carry weight. "You offered me shelter while I decided what comes next," she continued. "I have decided." She turned from the window then, and Jack saw something in her expression that made his coffee cup pause halfway to his lips. It was not fear or uncertainty. It was determination, mixed with something else he could not quite identify. "I want to stay here," she said. "With you?" The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Jack set his coffee down carefully, his mind racing through the implications of what she was suggesting. In this territory, there were certain understandings about what it meant when an unmarried woman chose to stay with an unmarried man. The frontier had its own moral code, harsh but clearly defined. "Sarah," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said. "My people have a winter camp in the mountains, but winter camps move with the seasons in the game. Those men yesterday, they will remember my face. They will remember that you interfered with their plans. If I go back to my people, I bring that danger with me." Jack nodded slowly. He had considered the same possibility during his own sleepless hours, turning the problem over in his mind like a chess player contemplating moves several turns ahead. But more than that, Sarah continued. I have been living between two worlds for most of my life. My grandmother taught me the old ways, the traditional songs and stories. The mission school taught me English and arithmetic and how to read the Bible. I know enough of white customs to function in your towns, enough of Lakota tradition to honor my ancestors. But I have never found a place where I truly belonged. She moved closer to where Jack stood, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the sage scent that seemed to cling to her skin. Yesterday, when you chose to help me instead of riding away, you did something that neither world prepared me for, she said. You acted without thinking about tribal boundaries or racial differences or what people would say. You just saw someone who needed help, and you helped. Jack found himself studying her face, trying to understand the full meaning behind her words. Sarah was intelligent enough to know that such a decision would carry consequences for both of them. The frontier was more tolerant than civilized places in some ways, but it had its own rigid expectations about how different people should interact. You know what people will think, he said quietly. I know what some people will think, she corrected. I also know that the opinion of people who would leave a woman to be tortured carries no weight with me. There was steel in her voice now, the same strength that had carried her through 3 days of captivity without breaking. Jack realized that this was not a desperate plea from a woman with no options. This was a calculated decision from someone who had weighed all the possibilities and chosen what she believed to be the best path forward. I can work, she continued. I know how to preserve meat, how to tan hides, how to identify edible and medicinal plants. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend injuries. I am not asking for charity. I am offering partnership. The word hit Jack like a physical blow. Partnership. Not marriage, not servitude, not temporary arrangement, but partnership. A joining of two people with complementary skills and mutual respect working together toward common goals. It had been 15 years since Jack had allowed himself to consider such a possibility. 15 years since he had trusted another person enough to build a life with them. The scars from his last attempt still ached sometimes, especially during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the mountain passes and reminded him why he had chosen solitude over the complications of human connection. But Sarah was not asking him to open old wounds or revisit past failures. She was offering something entirely different, a partnership based on practical need and mutual survival rather than romantic fantasy or social convention. Those men will come back, Jack said, testing her resolve. Yes, she agreed. And when they do, two people will face them instead of one. The nearest town is 40 miles away. Nearest neighbor is even further. It gets lonely out here, especially in winter. I have lived my entire life in wild places, Sarah replied. Loneliness is not the same as solitude, and solitude is not the same as abandonment. Jack walked to the window and looked out at his ranch, the corrals he had built, the barn he had raised beam by beam, the pastures he had fenced, and the cattle he had gathered. All of it represented years of backbreaking work, of careful planning, of dreams slowly made manifest through sweat and determination. Now this woman was asking to become part of that dream, to add her own labor and skills to what he had built, to help him transform a lonely ranch into something approaching a real home. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons to refuse. She was too young, too different, too much of an unknown quantity. The arrangement she proposed would scandalize some people and confuse others. It would change the careful balance of his life in ways he could not predict or control. But the deeper part of his mind, the part that had guided him through cavalry battles and cattle drives in 15 years of frontier survival, recognized something true in her offer. Sarah Crowfeather was not offering him romance or sentiment. She was offering him something far rarer and more valuable, a true partnership between equals, based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Winter comes early in this country, he said finally. By October, we might be snowed in for weeks at a time. No going to town, no contact with other people, just whatever supplies we have laid in and whatever we can provide for ourselves. I understand. The work is hard. Cattle need tending regardless of weather. Equipment breaks and has to be fixed. There are wolves and bears and men like those from yesterday who think they can take whatever they want. I understand. Jack turned from the window and found Sarah watching him with patience born of certainty. She had already made her decision and was simply waiting for him to catch up with the inevitable conclusion. If we do this, he said slowly, we do it right. Legal partnership, written contract, everything clear and defined. No room for misunderstanding later. A smile flickered across Sarah's face, not the polite expression she had worn the night before, but something deeper and more genuine. I would expect nothing less from a man who builds his corrals to last, she said. And with that simple acceptance, Jack Morrison's carefully ordered life took another step toward complexity he had not imagined when he rode out to check fence lines 3 days ago. But as he looked at Sarah standing in his kitchen, coffee cup in hand, morning light painting her features in gold, he found that the prospect of partnership did not frighten him as much as it probably should have. Perhaps 15 years of solitude had been preparation rather than exile. Perhaps all the lessons he had learned about survival and self-reliance had been leading to this moment when he would need to apply them not just to his own life, but to a shared future with someone whose strength complemented his own. Outside, his cattle were stirring in the morning warmth, and there were fences to check and hay to cut and a dozen other tasks that filled the days of anyone who chose to make a living from the unforgiving beauty of the Wyoming Territory. But now those tasks would be shared, and the burden that had rested solely on his shoulders for so long would be distributed between two people who understood what it meant to choose hard work over easy answers. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the day ahead in all its crystalline possibility. Somewhere to the south, 3 men nursed their wounds and planned their revenge. Somewhere to the north, Sarah's people continued their ancient patterns of movement across land that had been theirs for countless generations. But here, in this kitchen filled with morning light and the smell of fresh coffee, 2 people had just agreed to build something new together, not a conventional marriage or a temporary arrangement, but a true partnership forged in the crucible of frontier necessity and tempered by mutual respect. Jack Morrison had saved Sarah Crowfeather from a branding iron, but she was about to save him from something equally painful, the slow death of a man who had forgotten how to hope for more than mere survival. 3 weeks passed like pages in a well-written book, each day building naturally on the last, creating a rhythm that felt both new and inevitable. Sarah proved herself to be everything she had promised and more. She rose before dawn to tend the kitchen garden she had planted behind the house, her hands coaxing life from soil that had been barren for 15 years. She learned the temperament of each horse in Jack's remuda, could spot a lame cow from 100 yards away, and had an uncanny ability to predict weather changes hours before they arrived. But it was the small things that surprised Jack most. The way she hummed old Lakota songs while working, filling the ranch house with melodies that seemed to make the very walls more welcoming. The way she reorganized his pantry with an efficiency that revealed just how haphazard his bachelor existence had become. The way she listened when he talked about his plans for expanding the herd or improving the water system, offering suggestions that showed she understood both the practical and financial aspects of ranching. Most surprising of all was how natural it felt to have her there. Jack had expected awkwardness, the inevitable friction that came when 2 solitary people suddenly shared living space. Instead, he found that Sarah moved through his world with the same quiet grace she had shown that first morning, adding her presence without disrupting the fundamental rhythms that kept the ranch functioning. They worked side by side during the long summer days, building new sections of fence, moving cattle to fresh pasture, cutting and stacking hay for the coming winter. Sarah learned to handle a lariat with the patience of someone who understood that skill came through repetition rather than frustration. Jack found himself teaching her the finer points of reading cattle sign and weather patterns, skills that had taken him years to master, but which she absorbed with remarkable speed. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, planning the next day's work or discussing improvements they wanted to make. Their conversations ranged from the practical to the philosophical, touching on everything from the best methods for breaking horses to Sarah's stories of growing up between two cultures. It was during one of these evening conversations that Sarah first mentioned the dreams. "They come to me just before dawn," she said, her voice thoughtful rather than troubled. "Always the same 3 men, but in different places. Sometimes they are watching the ranch from the ridgeline. Sometimes they are in town, asking questions about us. Sometimes they are closer." Jack had been wondering when the other shoe would drop. 3 weeks was long enough for determined men to plan their next move, long enough to scout the territory and gather information about their target. He had been checking his back trail more carefully lately, keeping his rifle closer at hand, making sure the windows and doors were secured each night. "What do you think they are waiting for?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky. When she spoke, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had learned to trust her instincts above all else. "They are waiting for us to feel safe," she said. "Men like that understand patience when it serves their purpose. They know that people who expect trouble are harder to surprise than people who have begun to believe the danger has passed." Jack nodded, recognizing the tactical wisdom in her observation. During his cavalry days, he had seen how effective enemies could be when they waited for their targets to lower their guard. The Apache had been masters of such patience, capable of watching and waiting for weeks until the perfect moment presented itself. "Then we do not give them that moment," he said. The next morning brought news that confirmed Sarah's intuition. Tom Bradley, who owned the general store in the nearest town, rode out with supplies and information that made Jack's blood run cold. 3 men came through town yesterday, Tom reported, accepting the coffee Sarah offered him. "Strangers, but the kind that make decent folks cross the street. They were asking questions about you, Jack. Wanted to know about your spread, how many hands you run, whether you live alone." Tom's weathered face showed the concern of a man who had lived long enough to recognize trouble when it wore human form. "I told them nothing, of course, but others might not be so careful. Word is they are offering money for information." Jack and Sarah exchanged glances. The net was tightening, just as they had expected it would. "What kind of men?" Sarah asked. "The kind that carry too many guns and not enough soap," Tom replied. "But organized, if you know what I mean, not just drifters looking for easy money. These boys have a plan." After Tom left, Jack and Sarah spent the afternoon preparing for what now seemed inevitable. They checked every rifle and pistol on the ranch, making sure they were clean and loaded. Sarah proved to have an excellent eye for defensive positions, pointing out sight lines and cover that Jack had not considered. Together, they moved supplies to strategic locations and made sure every possible approach to the ranch house could be observed and defended. "How many men do you think they have recruited?" Sarah asked as they worked. "Hard to say," Jack replied. "But men who offer money for information usually have enough backing to make good on their promises." "Could be 6, could be a dozen." Sarah nodded, her face showing no fear despite the odds they potentially faced. Jack found himself marveling at her composure. Most people would be terrified at the prospect of being outnumbered by armed men seeking revenge. Sarah seemed to view it as simply another problem to be solved through careful planning and decisive action. That night, they took turns standing watch. Jack took the first shift, positioning himself at the upstairs window that provided the best view of the southern approach. The hours passed slowly, marked by the familiar sounds of night creatures and cattle settling in the darkness. Around midnight, Sarah came to relieve him, moving through the house with the silence of someone who had learned to walk without disturbing sleeping prey. "Anything?" she whispered. "Quiet so far?" Jack replied. But quiet can be deceiving. Sarah settled into position at the window, her rifle resting easily in her hands. In the moonlight, Jack could see the alert patience in her posture, the readiness of someone who understood that survival often depended on the ability to remain motionless for hours while staying completely aware of one's surroundings. "Jack," she said softly as he prepared to head downstairs, "when this is over, regardless of how it ends, I want you to know something." Jack paused, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to say. "These past 3 weeks have been the happiest of my life," she continued. "Not because they have been easy, but because they have felt like building something real, something that belongs to us." The words hit Jack with unexpected force. For 3 weeks, he had been so focused on the practical aspects of their partnership that he had not fully acknowledged the emotional transformation taking place within him. Sarah was right. They had been building something real, something that went beyond mere convenience or mutual benefit. "Mine too," he said quietly, and realized as he spoke that it was completely true. Dawn brought with it a strange stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. Jack woke to find Sarah already dressed and standing at the kitchen window, her rifle in her hands. "They are here," she said without turning around. Jack joined her at the window and saw what had caught her attention. Dust clouds on the horizon, moving in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than chance. Multiple groups converging on the ranch from different directions, timing their approach to arrive simultaneously. "How many?" Jack asked, quickly pulling on his clothes and checking his weapons. "At least 8, Sarah replied. "Maybe more. They are trying to surround us." Jack felt the familiar calm that came over him in moments of extreme danger, the same clarity of thought that had kept him alive through cavalry battles and frontier conflicts. Fear was a luxury he could not afford right now. What mattered was clear thinking, careful planning, and the determination to make their attackers pay dearly for whatever they managed to accomplish. "Upstairs," he said. "Better fields of fire, harder for them to reach us." They gathered their weapons and ammunition, moving with the efficient coordination of people who had prepared for this moment. Sarah took position at the front window while Jack covered the back approach. The ranch house had been built with defense and mine-thick walls, few windows, clear sight lines in all directions. The first shots came just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, muzzle flashes winking from positions around the ranch. Jack counted at least 6 different locations, confirming that they were badly outnumbered. But being outnumbered was not the same as being outmatched, especially when the defenders held superior positions and knew the ground better than their attackers. Jack's first shot took down a man who had been trying to reach the barn, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into the dust. Sarah's rifle cracked almost simultaneously, and Jack saw another attacker clutch his shoulder and scramble for cover behind the water trough. "They are trying to get close enough to set fire to the house," Sarah called out, working the lever action of her Winchester with practiced efficiency. Jack had reached the same conclusion. Fire was the classic solution when attackers faced well-defended positions. Drive the defenders out with smoke and flames, then finish them in the open where superior numbers would tell. For the next hour, the battle raged with the intensity of a summer thunderstorm. The attackers made several attempts to reach the house, only to be driven back by accurate fire from the windows above. Jack and Sarah moved from position to position, never staying in one place long enough for their enemies to get a clear shot, making every round count. But ammunition was not infinite, and their attackers seemed willing to trade casualties for the chance to wear down the defenders' supplies. Jack counted at least 3 men down, but others kept coming, pressing closer with each assault. "Jack," Sarah called out during a brief lull in the firing. "I am running low on ammunition." Jack checked his own supply and felt his heart sink. 24 rounds left, maybe 3 if he had miscounted. Not nearly enough to hold off determined attackers for much longer. That was when he heard the sound that changed everything: hoofbeats approaching from the north, moving fast and in formation. Jack's first thought was that the attackers had brought reinforcements, but the sound was wrong somehow. Too organized, too disciplined. Sarah was at the north window now, and Jack heard her intake of breath. "Cavalry," she said, her voice filled with amazement. Jack joined her at the window and saw them, a full troop of blue-uniformed soldiers cresting the ridge at a gallop, their guidons snapping in the morning wind. At their head rode a familiar figure, someone Jack had not seen in over a decade but would recognize anywhere. Captain William Hayes, Jack's former commanding officer, led the charge with the same aggressive competence that had made him legendary among the frontier cavalry. The soldiers spread out in a practice skirmish line, their carbines already speaking as they bore down on the attackers surrounding the ranch. The effect was immediate and devastating. Men who had been confidently pressing their attacks suddenly found themselves caught between the defenders in the house and a full troop of experienced cavalry soldiers. The battle, which had seemed hopeless moments before, suddenly shifted in favor of justice. Jack watched through the window as their attackers broke and ran, abandoning their positions and racing for their horses. But Hayes had anticipated this move, sending part of his force to cut off the escape routes while the remainder continued the direct assault. Within minutes, it was over. The surviving attackers found themselves surrounded and dismounted, their hands raised in surrender while cavalry troopers covered them with carbines. The three men who had started this whole affair lay motionless in the dust, their quest for revenge ended permanently. Jack and Sarah made their way downstairs and out onto the porch, where Captain Hayes was dismounting from his horse. The years had added gray to his hair and lines to his face, but he moved with the same confident authority that Jack remembered from their service together. "Hello, Jack," Hayes said, extending his hand. "Thought you might need some help." "How did you know?" Jack asked, gripping his former commander's hand. "Tom Bradley rode into Fort Collins yesterday with word that trouble was heading your way," Hayes explained. "Seemed like the kind of trouble that called for an official response." Sarah stepped forward, and Jack saw Hayes take note of her presence with the quick assessment of a professional soldier. "Captain Hayes, this is Sarah Crowfeather." "Sarah, Captain Hayes commanded my old unit." Hayes touched his hat brim respectfully. "MAAM. I understand you have been having some difficulties with these gentlemen." "Nothing we could not handle," Sarah replied, and Jack heard the quiet pride in her voice. Hayes smiled at that, recognizing the steel beneath her polite words. "I do not doubt it. But sometimes it helps to have official backing when dealing with men who operate outside the law." The cleanup took most of the morning. The dead were wrapped and loaded onto horses for transport back to town, where they would be buried in the section of the cemetery reserved for those whose names were not worth remembering. The survivors were questioned and then shackled for the journey to Fort Collins, where they would face trial for attempted murder and various other charges. As the cavalry troop prepared to leave, Captain Hayes pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. "You have built something good here," Hayes said, looking around at the ranch with obvious approval. "Takes a special kind of courage to make a life in country like this." "Different kind of courage than we needed in the cavalry," Jack replied. "Maybe," Hayes said, "but courage all the same. And it looks like you found someone who understands that." Jack glanced toward Sarah, who was helping tend to a wounded trooper with the same calm competence she brought to every task. "She saved me as much as I saved her," he said. Hayes nodded, understanding passing between two men who had seen enough of life to recognize truth when they heard it. "The Army is building new posts throughout this territory. If you ever need official backing again, send word to Fort Collins. We take care of our own." After the cavalry departed, Jack and Sarah spent the afternoon repairing the damage from the morning's battle. Bullet holes needed patching, scattered equipment required gathering, and the normal rhythms of ranch life had to be restored. But as they worked, Jack noticed a different quality to their partnership. The threat that had hung over them for weeks was finally gone. eliminated not just by superior firepower, but by the intervention of legitimate authority. They were free now to build their life together without looking over their shoulders, free to plan for a future that extended beyond mere survival. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind mountains that no longer concealed hidden enemies, Sarah spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I want to be your woman, Jack Morrison. Not just your partner in work, but your woman in all the ways that matter." Jack had been expecting this moment, had been thinking about it during the long hours of preparation and the violent morning of battle. Sarah had proved herself in every way that counted: courage, competence, loyalty, intelligence. But more than that, she had shown him that partnership between equals was not only possible, but could create something stronger than either person could achieve alone. "And I want you to be my woman, Sarah Crowfeather," he replied, "in all the ways that matter." The words hung in the evening air like a vow, more binding than any legal document or religious ceremony. They had been tested by violence and proven by partnership. They had built something real together, something that belonged to them alone. Sarah moved closer on the porch swing, close enough that Jack could feel the warmth of her body against his arm. For the first time since they had met, there were no immediate threats to face, no urgent decisions to make, no enemies approaching through the darkness. "The winter will be long," Sarah said softly. "Yes," Jack agreed. "We will have time to learn about each other. Time to discover what we are building." "Yes." Sarah smiled and leaned against his shoulder, her head finding the perfect place to rest as if it had been designed for that purpose. Around them, the ranch settled into evening, quiet cattle lowing softly in the distance, horses moving restlessly in the corral, the familiar sounds of a working spread preparing for night. But now those sounds carried a different meaning. This was no longer Jack Morrison's ranch where Sarah Crowfeather happened to live and work. This was their ranch, their home, their shared future taking shape one day at a time. The following weeks brought the kind of settled contentment that Jack had never expected to experience. With the threat of the three men permanently eliminated, he and Sarah were free to focus on building their life together without the constant vigilance that had marked their early days. Sarah threw herself into preparations for winter with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival in Wyoming territory depended on careful planning and hard work. She expanded her garden, preserving vegetables and herbs that would provide nutrition during the months when fresh food was scarce. She worked with Jack to increase their supply of firewood, knowing that the difference between comfort and misery during a frontier winter often came down to having enough fuel to keep the house warm. Most importantly, she began to transform the ranch house from a bachelor's functional dwelling into a real home. Her touches were subtle but profound: wildflowers in mason jars on the kitchen table, curtains sewn from fabric she had traded for in town, the addition of comfortable cushions to the furniture that made the long winter evenings more pleasant. Jack found himself marveling at the changes, not just in his physical surroundings but in himself. For 15 years, he had lived according to a rigid routine designed to maximize efficiency and minimize emotional complications. Now he discovered the pleasure of flexibility, of allowing his plans to be influenced by someone else's needs and desires. When Sarah suggested they visit her people's winter camp before the snow flew, Jack agreed without hesitation. The journey would take time away from ranch work during a critical season, but he understood that maintaining Sarah's connection to her heritage was essential to her happiness. The trip to the Lakota camp proved to be a revelation. Jack had expected suspicion, perhaps hostility, but what he encountered instead was careful assessment followed by gradual acceptance. Sarah's grandmother, a woman whose age was impossible to determine but whose wisdom was evident in every word she spoke, questioned Jack thoroughly about his intentions and his understanding of the responsibilities that came with loving a Lakota woman. "She wants to know if you will honor Sarah's need to maintain her traditions," Sarah translated during one of their conversations. If you understand that taking a native wife means accepting part of her world, not just expecting her to adapt completely to yours. Jack's answer was immediate and heartfelt. Tell her that I fell in love with Sarah exactly as she is. I have no desire to change her or separate her from the things that make her who she is. The grandmother nodded approvingly, and Jack sensed that he had passed a crucial test. Over the next 3 days, he participated in hunts, listened to stories around evening fires, and began to understand the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that bound the Lakota community together. Most importantly, he saw Sarah in her own element, watching her demonstrate traditional crafts and participate in ceremonies that connected her to generations of ancestors. The joy on her face during these moments confirmed what Jack had already begun to understand, that their partnership would only be successful if it honored both their backgrounds. On their last evening in camp, Sarah's grandmother presented them with a gift that took Jack's breath away. It was a buffalo robe, intricately painted with symbols that told the story of a successful hunt, tanned to butter softness and decorated with quillwork that represented hundreds of hours of careful labor. "She says this is for our marriage bed," Sarah translated, her voice soft with emotion. "It has been in our family for 3 generations, and she wants us to have it as a symbol of her blessing on our union." The journey back to the ranch was filled with quiet contentment. They rode through country that grew more familiar with each mile, but Jack found himself seeing it with new eyes. This was not just his land anymore, it was their land. A place where 2 people from different worlds were creating something entirely new. As their ranch house came into view, surrounded by the rolling pastures and distant mountains that had become the landscape of their shared life, Jack felt a deep sense of completion. This was home in every sense that mattered, a place where love had taken root and was growing into something that would endure. That night, as they sat on the porch swing that had become their favorite place for evening conversations, Sarah spoke the words that formalized their commitment in the traditional way of her people. "In my grandmother's tradition, when a woman chooses to bind her life to a man's, she does so with a ceremony that involves the sharing of sacred smoke and the exchange of gifts that represent their promises to each other." Jack listened carefully, understanding that what she was describing was more than just cultural information. It was an invitation, a proposal offered in the traditional way of her people. "What gifts would we exchange?" he asked. Sarah smiled, reaching into the leather pouch she always wore at her side. She withdrew a small object wrapped in soft deerskin, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a knife with an intricately carved bone handle. "This was my father's knife," she said. "I offer it to you as a symbol of my trust, my willingness to place my safety and my future in your hands." Jack accepted the knife with the reverence it deserved, understanding the magnitude of what Sarah was offering. Then he reached into his own pocket and withdrew the gold ring he had purchased in town during their last visit, a simple band that had cost him 2 months' profit from cattle sales, but which felt absolutely essential to this moment. "This ring represents my promise to you," he said, offering it to Sarah with hands that trembled slightly. "My commitment to stand beside you through whatever challenges we face, to honor your traditions while building new ones together." Sarah accepted the ring with tears glistening in her eyes, sliding it onto her finger where it caught the starlight and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. In that moment, Jack understood that they had just participated in something far more meaningful than any legal ceremony or religious service could provide. They held each other then, there on the porch of their ranch house, surrounded by the vast silence of the Wyoming wilderness. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blessing this moment when 2 people who had found each other against all odds promised to build a life together based on love, respect, and the unshakable conviction that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any difference. The brand of mercy had left its mark on both their lives, transforming a moment of violence into the foundation of something beautiful. And in the gathering darkness of a frontier night, Jack Morrison and Sarah Crowfeather began the long, Sweet work of learning how to be happy together.